He always thought that the real ghost of Christmas doesn't arrive on the 25th. Its waiting breath held, just across the threshold of the 24th. We spend December in a state of controlled chaos. The rush for gifts, the endless loop of saccharine holiday soundtracks, the forced cheer of the office party. But then, somewhere between the last desperate purchase and the final twist of the ribbon, a profound shift occurs. A kind of mandatory, collective sigh. It's the evening of Christmas Eve, and suddenly the world stops spinning. I am interested in that precise moment. I'm interested in the unquestioned rule that dictates that by 8 p.m., the lights of every major retailer dim to darkness, the traffic thins to a trickle, and a silence descends upon the city that feels wholly unnatural. It's not just the quiet of people resting, it's the quiet of a community holding its breath. It is a universal, unspoken curfew. And while we dress this phenomenon up in sentimentality, the beauty of the family coming together, the quiet anticipation of the morning, I've spent too long in the archives to accept the easy answer. The Christmas Eve rule is perhaps the most absolute domestic law we obey. No matter how fractured the family, no matter how great the distance, the command is clear: you must be where you are meant to be. You must be safe. But safety from what? Think about the palpable relief when the last guest is settled and the front door is finally bolted shut. That feeling is not mere exhaustion, it is vestigial, an ancient impulse kicking in. We instinctively treat the 24th of December not as a transition into joy, but as a hard deadline imposed by an invisible authority. We move our children, our grandparents, our fragile elderly relatives, often through blizzards and across state lines, just to ensure they are sheltered, in position before the chime of midnight. We accept the frantic, borderline desperate travel schedule, because the consequence of being caught outside on the night itself feels deep down too great to risk. This enforced cessation of activity predates modern Christianity. It is a memory embedded in our collective societal blueprint, a nervous habit passed down through generations who forgot the original threat, but still remember the required posture of defense. I believe that the peace we cherish on Christmas Eve is not a gift. It is a meticulously constructed barrier. When I first started tracing the history of mandatory shutdowns in British and American records, the early closing times, the specific legislative pushes for domestic quietude, I expected to find economic reasoning, giving employees time off. What I found instead were layers of ritualistic dread, buried deep within the bureaucratic language. The rules weren't designed simply to grant rest. They were designed to ensure universal compliance with an overnight requirement that no one felt comfortable naming. Everywhere I looked, from the specific times clocks struck for required church services in Puritan New England to the medieval edicts on extinguishing hearth fires after dusk, the underlying message was the same. This night is different. This night requires protection, and the protection required every soul to be accounted for, sealed in their immediate, parochial sphere. We have metabolized this fear into beautiful tradition. We tell our children it is the magic that holds the air, the moment Santa begins his flight, but the historical record suggests that the stillness was originally intended not to welcome something benevolent, but to ward off something ancient, roaming, and profoundly dangerous, something that operated most freely in the darkest hours of the winter solstice. I promise we will peel back the veneer of sentimentality, look past the tinsel and the carols, and examine the true origin of this iron-clad curfew. We will discover exactly funded when, who, or favor dictated that every good citizen must be locked down, indoors, lights on, awaiting a dawn that promised safety, if they could just survive the long, silent hours in between. The question I cannot shake is this: if the silence of Christmas Eve is a rule, and all rules are implemented to control or prevent, then exactly what kind of entity requires a world full of people to enforce a mandatory, sudden standstill, year after year, without ever having to announce its name? The 24th of December, the pivot point. Not merely the day preceding the main event, but a specific, narrow passage of time. A hallway between one calendar year and the next, between the longest night and the promise of returning light. The official story, the one imprinted on us by Dickens and department stores, is simple. Christmas Eve is the night of preparation. We are focused entirely on the 25th, careful gift wrapping, and the final, frantic push for perfection before the family arrives. It is characterized by exhaustion. Yes, but crucially, by an enforced and almost absolute silence. We believe this silence is sacred, domestic, and benign. We are told we are waiting for Santa Claus, a benign, domesticated deity whose only purpose is distribution. But if you strip away the velvet and the saccharine sweetness of the Victorian invention, you find that the silence is far older, far colder, and far more demanding. I often think of the ancients, particularly in the northern reaches of the UK and Europe, who understood the 24th of December not as a pause, but as a crisis. It wasn't a time to relax. It was a time of extreme vulnerability. It was the moment the calendar turned, the moment the boundaries thinned to the consistency of tissue paper. They called it, in some Anglo-Saxon traditions, Fufindranite, the night of the mothers, or simply, the threshold of Yule. This was the dark, uncontrolled heart of winter where spirits walked. The wild hunt rode, and the fate of the coming year was decided not by hope, but by terror. This is the original soil from which the rule grew. To survive such a night, one had to be meticulously attentive, constantly warding. Fires weren't lit just for warmth. They were lit for protection, drawing a hard circle of light around the vulnerable hearth. The silence we observe today is a faint, inherited echo of the ancient need to be absolutely quiet, lest you attract the attention of something moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. The institutionalization of Christmas required the domestication of this fear. The church, and later the emerging state structures concerned with order and commerce, could not tolerate a widely acknowledged annual night of chaos, spirit movement, and communal anxiety. They had to take the night of the wild hunt and turn it into the night of silent prayer. And so, they implemented the rule, "For I do not address the darkness tonight." The rule is a magnificent feat of social engineering. It isn't about piety, it's about control. It compels us to focus all our attention inward, on the immediate family unit, on the rituals of consumption, on the preparation for a flawless morning. By making the morning of the 25th the absolute, non-negotiable goal, the messy, dangerous reality of the 24th is officially cancelled. When you see a house absolutely blazing with light on Christmas Eve, every window glowing, every corner filled with sound and movement, it is not merely festive. It is a necessary strategic defense against the very ancient understanding of what this night represents. We are not celebrating the 25th yet. We are trying to survive the 24th intact. What the rule effectively dictates is the immediate suppression of all unresolved conflict, all lingering grief, and all uncomfortable truths. The resentments accumulated over the year, the unspoken financial stress, the worry over a parent's health, the uncomfortable presence of the empty chair. These are all packed away, sealed tightly beneath the veneer of wrapping paper and carols. This night becomes a pressure cooker where the lid is held down, not by physical force, but by social consent. On some level, that to introduce genuine discord, or to admit genuine fear on Christmas Eve, is the ultimate violation. To cry uncontrollably, to confess a hidden sin, to acknowledge the deep, structural failures of the year. These acts are culturally taboo. They are breaches of the rule, because the rule understands that if you allow one thread of authentic darkness to penetrate the enforced cheer of the 24th of December, the entire structure of the subsequent holiday unravels. It is an acknowledgement that certain truths possess an explosive power, and if they are released on the night when the veil is thinnest, they might not be easily contained again. This tacit agreement, this collective decision to look only forward, never sideways, never behind, is why the rule is so effective. It is why we question the origin of the holiday itself, but never the behavioral demands placed upon us this specific evening. The rule exists to ensure that whatever comes knocking on this threshold night remains unanswered. But my experience in the archives tells me that seals crack, and silence is often the loudest invitation to those things we try so desperately to ignore. What happens when the sheer weight of what we are suppressing finally forces the lock? And what happens when the things the ancients feared, the real, immediate reckoning of the midwinter, are forced back into the artificial light of a modern American or British living room? We believe we are waiting for midnight for Santa. Perhaps, historically, we were waiting for midnight, simply to know we had survived the night. I found the fault line. Not in the brittle traditions of European kings, but in the newly industrialized nervous system of the American dream. A system built on speed, extraction, and the enforced poverty of the worker. To understand the true weight of silence we often impose upon the 24th of December, we have to look west, to a forgotten corner of Michigan, known as Copper Country. I had been tracing the records of societal breakdown, looking for the precise moment when the promise of Christmas dissolved into panic, requiring the cold hammer of administrative order to restore the illusion of peace. I found it, starkly illuminated by the inadequate glow of flickering gaslight, in the headline of the 25th of December 1913. It wasn't about gifts, or carols, or even the weather. It was about breathlessness and crushing walls. The headline was simple, brutal: 73 perish in panic at Calumet Christmas party. Asterisk, this was Calumet, Michigan, the center of the world's greatest copper deposits. A place of staggering wealth for the mine owners and staggering brutality for the immigrant workers, Finns, Croatians, Italians, who worked the shafts. For months, they had been engaged in a desperate strike against the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company. Hunger was a constant guest at their tables. On Christmas Eve, the community hall known as Italian Hall offered a brief, vital reprieve. The Western Federation of Miners had organized a party for the children of the striking workers. Imagine the scene: a room filled with the steam of winter coats, the sharp scent of inexpensive pine needles, and the glorious, chaotic sound of children momentarily forgetting cold and hunger. It was a defiant, collective moment of hope, pressed against the relentless power of the company. It was roughly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The room was packed. Hundreds of children, maybe 600 people total, were celebrating. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability, maximum joy. And then someone standing near the top of the main stairwell. A steep, narrow flight of stairs designed for traffic, not panic, yelled one word: fire. There was no fire. The sheer terror of that word, in a wooden building, surrounded by flammable decorations, and surrounded by weeks of strike tension, was enough. A wave of humanity, children first, surged toward the single, critical exit. The subsequent events were not defined by flame, but by architecture and malice. Crucial exit door at the bottom of the stairs, which opened inward, had been locked, or perhaps deliberately barred. I read the coroner's reports and the transcripts of the inquests. The descriptions are sterile, yet horrifying. The pressure of the crowd, the small bodies tumbling down the unforgiving wooden steps, pressed into the unforgiving wood of the door. They didn't burn. They suffocated. 73 people died, 59 of them children, crushed into a silent, impenetrable wedge against the impenetrable door. This, I submit, is where one specific, unspoken Christmas Eve rule was forged. The rule that chaos must never be permitted to happen in the presence of seasonal celebration. When the disaster was cleared, when the silent procession of small caskets began through the icy streets, the entire community, already fractured by the strike, shattered. But the state and the company reaction was immediate and absolute. It wasn't focused on identifying the person who yelled, "Fire," who many locals believed was a hired anti-union agent, a claim the officials quickly dismissed. No, the focus was on neutralizing the flood disruption team. The military presence, already heavy due to the ongoing strike, tightened its grip. The emotional chaos of a town burying 73 children had to be controlled. The response was a definitive, chilling declaration. Christmas Eve is a time for enforced order, your collective demonstration of vulnerability. it must be silenced. The irony is piercing. This wasn't a spontaneous act of God. It was a societal failure, exacerbated by profound class warfare and the deliberate design of inadequate safety measures. The lesson learned by the wider American public was simple: massive public gathering, especially during this sacred time, risks total annihilation. If joy can be inverted into silent horror so quickly, how can we prevent it? By preemptively minimizing all external chaos. This event, largely scrubbed from the national memory save for a haunting plaque, provided the definitive historical template for why the lead, up to the 25th of December, must be characterized by internal control and external quiet. We are culturally terrified of the collective surge, of the sudden, inexplicable loss of control that Calumet suffered. Think of how intensely we police our immediate surroundings on that day, how obsessively we plan the travel, the meals, the schedules. Any deviation feels like a violation of a fragile, necessary truce. This quiet is not born of spiritual contemplation. It is the deep, inherited reflex of a society terrified of what happens when the festive veneer breaks. We worry that if we let our guard down, if we allow one person to scream fire, even falsely, the doors will lock, the authorities will prioritize containment over rescue, and the silence that follows will be permanent. This imposed stillness, this rule that Christmas Eve must be predictable and contained, is the ghost of those Calumet children pressed against an inward, swinging door, a terrible pressure exerted on the fabric of American society that demanded no more chaos before the dawn. Asterisk, and the cost of that enforced peace, I realized, was the collective forgetting of the precise moment that trauma occurred. The archive is rarely concerned with good intentions. It is concerned with mechanisms, the hidden gears that control mass behavior. We establish the universal hush, the global simultaneous feeling that on Christmas Eve, the world must simply stop. The official narrative tells us this is the expectant pause before the miracle of Christmas morning. But the deeper I dug into the forgotten ledgers and the earliest medieval canons, the clearer the distortion became. The rule, I realized, was never about waiting for the sun to rise. It was about controlling the darkness. Our modern minds, slaves to the clean digital calendar, assume a day begins precisely at midnight. We assume the 24th of December is a 24-hour block. And then, the 25th of December begins. But for centuries, across the European cultures that forged the backbone of this tradition, the temporal rules were fundamentally different. A sacred day did not begin with the stroke of midnight. It began when the sun set on the preceding calendar date. This is not mere theological pedantry. It is the pivot point of the twist. If you accept the ancient reckoning, and the medieval church certainly did, drawing on Hebraic traditions, then the moment the twilight faded on the 24th of December, Christmas Day had already begun. Think about that for a moment. All the mandatory stillness, all the closed shutters, the cessation of commerce, the curfew that feels woven into the very fabric of the air on Christmas Eve. That was not preparation. That was the mandated observance of the holy day itself. The 24th of December, as we currently define it, is largely a historical phantom, a necessary container for the hours between dawn and sunset. But the real weight, the solemnity, the systemic shutdown we still feel today, begins exactly when the lights come on and the dark descends. We are not observing the run. Up to Christmas, we are living through the quiet, deep heart of Christmas Day, seen through the historical lens of night. This simple calendrical shift reframes everything about the Christmas Eve rule. It stops being a romantic narrative of anticipation and starts being a mechanism of control. Why did the church and civil authorities insist on this stringent nocturnal observance? It touches on a fear far older than the birth narrative, the profound civil dread of the winter solstice, the longest, most dangerous night. In a world without reliable street lighting, without police forces, the darkness of deep winter was chaos incarnate. It was when the truly forgotten, the desperate, and the criminal moved. By declaring that the sacred day began at dusk, authorities essentially weaponized divine instruction to enforce civil stability. The mandatory quiet of Christmas Eve wasn't a choice. It was a non-negotiable curfew. I looked at the records of the watch, the medieval guards and bell ringers, and their duties on the night of the 24th. Unlike other feast days where merriment might spill into the streets, the regulations around Christmas Eve were universally draconian. The penalty for being found outside unchaperoned after the curfew bell was far steeper than on a standard night. It was an enforced stillness that served two masters: the spiritual need for reverence and the very practical need to keep the darkest period of the year from erupting into lawlessness. The faith provided the perfect, unimpeachable justification for the ultimate security measure. The feeling we have now, the pressure to be home, the relief when we are settled. It is not merely the nostalgia of childhood excitement. It is the echo of hundreds of years of mandated security. We are subconsciously submitting to the curfew bell that long ago stopped ringing. This brings us to the forgotten detail, the chilling punctuation mark found deep within the archives of English tradition. It concerns the widespread use of the Yule candle and the fire. The tradition holds that on Christmas Eve, the fire must be maintained and the special candle lit, often lasting all night. We see this today as cozy ritual. But originally, the candle and the hearth fire served as much more than decoration. They were your witness. If you were home, the lights served as visible proof to the watch passing outside that you were observing the curfew. And critically, they were a defense against the very real dangers of freezing or being taken by surprise in the absolute blackness that defined the Christmas Eve rule, then, is not a rule about religious observance in the modern sense. It is the longest, running, most universally accepted enforcement of an ancient civil curfew that has been successfully cloaked in sanctity. We are forced to confront the truth. The 24th is not a day for excited preparation. It is the bulk of the 25th, already underway, already silent, defined not by the birth of hope, but by the necessity of survival in the deep, dangerous cold. The anticipation we feel is simply the modern rebranding of mandatory submission to the night. And what happens when you peel away the religious drapery and see the bare bones of the security protocol? You see that the enduring power of the Christmas Eve rule is not its promise of joy, but its delivery of absolute temporary social control. For one night, every year, we voluntarily cede movement and external activity to embrace stillness and safety, fulfilling a requirement put in place by medieval rulers who feared the unmanaged darkness more than anything else. Once you realize the quiet settling on your house tonight is the sound of a historical curfew, intended to keep you off the streets of a long-ago dangerous city, you start to hear a different kind of authority in the silence. It's a powerful, almost oppressive sense of fauchemustin, a command issued across centuries, delivered not by scripture, but by the necessity of the long, dark calendar. Are you ready for Christmas? Is a pale imitation of the original, unspoken command. Are you safely inside before the darkness fully takes hold? And that, I realized, is a feeling you cannot unsee once the truth of the calendar is laid bare. The magic of Christmas Eve is merely the perfect historical camouflage for the night the authorities demanded we stay home. We looked behind the curtain of the calendar, behind the mistletoe and the flickering candlelight, and found something far colder than winter air. We found that the seemingly innocuous rules dictating the tenor of Christmas Eve were never truly about spiritual devotion or familial peace. They were always about administrative control, a forced tidiness designed to minimize complexity and ultimately ensure historical amnesia. The quiet anticipation we now recognize as the essence of the 24th of December is, for me, forever tainted by the knowledge of what it once concealed. As an archivist, I understand the seductive power of a clean narrative. It is infinitely easier to believe that the world goes quiet at sundown, because we too soon sit to retreat into warmth, rather than recognizing that this silence was once enforced, because the alternative, the necessary truth, the disruptive memory, the required shift, was deemed too inconvenient for the ruling structures. Think, now, about that specific pause, that uncanny stillness that falls over the Western world between sunset and midnight on the 24th. That inherited hush is the profound cost of the tradition. We are participating in an agreement made decades ago, an implicit contract to stop asking why the streetlights seem dimmer, why the commercial clamor dies with such sudden finality, and why the official world closes its doors so rigidly. You cannot know this. When you look at the clock this year, marking the moment the official rule takes hold, you teach us see a preparation for joy. You will see the ghost of an enforced silence, a deliberate erasure designed to pave the way for a smooth, uninterrupted holiday. And that, I suppose, is the only reason I keep these files open, to ensure we remember what we paid for the comfort of an unquestioned date. The file is closed, for now.